I'm Ross Ramsey, Executive Editor of the Texas Tribune. Thank you for tuning in to our conversation on rural Texas and the 87th Legislature, part of the Texas Tribune's symposium on the future of rural Texas. I'm joined today by Senator Chuy Hinojosa and State Representatives Tracy King, Drew Springer, Geanie Morrison, and James White. I'll do a brief introduction here. Senator Hinojosa has represented Senate District 20 since 2003. He serves as Vice Chair of the Senate Finance Committee and sits on the Agriculture, Natural Resources and Economic Development, Property Tax, and Transportation Committees. Representative King has represented District 80 in the House since 2005. He serves on Licensing and Administrative Procedures Committee and sits on the Natural Resources Committee. Representative Geanie Morrison has represented House District 30 since 1999. She serves as chair of the Local and Consent Calendars Committee and sits on the Culture, Recreation and Tourism, and Environmental Regulation Committees. Representative Springer has represented House District 68 since 2013. He serves as chair, he serves as chair of the House Agriculture and Livestock Committee and sits on the Local and Consent Calendars and State Affairs Committee. And Representative White has represented House District 19 since 2010. He serves as chair of the House Corrections Committee and sits on the Judiciary and Civil Jurisprudence, Redistricting, and Driver's License Issuance and Renewal Committees. Let's get started. I want to talk about some of the issues that are facing rural Texas, and in particular that will get some attention in the legislative session that starts in January. You know, this session kind of starts and stops with the state budget, as so many of them do. The comptroller has said we're going to be billions of dollars short in the current budget. He hasn't issued his estimate yet for what kind of budget you'll be writing for the next 2 years. But as you go into this, it looks like a tight budget. It looks like there's going to be some competition for funds in this. And I guess we'll start in the upper house, Senator Hinojosa. What do you think it looks like for rural Texas in this next budget?
Well, quite frankly, we had a great session last session when we passed a budget of $254 billion. And we used $6 billion from the rainy day fund. And we really tried to cover as much as we could and help rural Texas, especially the hospitals, quite frankly, that are on life support. But having said that, we were cruising at a great pace. Our economy was buzzing real nicely at a 4% unemployment rate, probably the best one in the nation. But then we got hit by double whammy, the pandemic, COVID-19, and the pretty much a crashing of oil and gas, two main sources of revenue for our budget. So when we left last session, we had approximately $3 billion surplus. And now we are facing a $4.7 billion deficit. We still have approximately $8.6 billion funding in our rainy day fund. Keeping in mind that we used $6 billion out of the rainy day fund last session. So coming this session, do we face some challenges? Definitely. But I think for rural Texas, so the litany of challenges that we face in rural Texas, from healthcare, from broadband, from education, from the economy, we continue to lose population in our rural areas in Texas. The growth continues to decrease. And then as we build our infrastructure, we continue to build expressways that bypass our small rural towns, which really leaves them more exposed to losing jobs and a weaker economy. So for us, when we talk about do we have to subsidize rural Texas? I wouldn't say we have to subsidize. I would have to say we have to invest more money in rural Texas to focus on some of the key needs. And they have a lot to offer, from agriculture to oil and gas, wind energy. And a lot of the young people that leave rural Texas and then don't return, it's a real challenge for us in trying to find ways to entice them to go back to Texas. I'll stop at that, but I will say this. Our challenges this coming session are many, but if you recall, I think it was 2011, we had a recession. We had a $15 billion deficit. We made some painful cuts, but quite frankly, I don't see those type of painful cuts this coming session, only because as long as we stay within $5 billion deficit and we have our $8.6 billion rainy day fund, we'll be able to manage. Keeping in mind that we made a huge commitment this last session when we increased public education by $11.5 billion. We really reformed the way we finance public education by focusing on the needs of students and not on the wealth of school districts. But that includes our rural areas. And one thing that really concerns me is that many of our school districts are shut down. Our economy is barely opening up. The rate of revenue is increased somewhat for our state budget. But our students all over the state are suffering because many do not have broadband or connectivity to internet, especially in the rural areas. So that's a really a real drawback and very painful that we really have to address next session and fill in the gaps that we found out exist in our healthcare system, quite frankly, throughout the pandemic COVID-19.
Representative Morrison, can we pick that up there at the broadband thing? I'm curious about broadband. This has been a refrain from rural Texas for a long time, that we need broadband, we need this kind of infrastructure. The pandemic and the demands it's put on education and work have really brought this to the front burner here. I'm curious what you think the legislature needs to do and will do on broadband.
Right. Well, absolutely. As Senator Hinojosa was saying, this has been a very trying time where we are with the pandemic and all of the new issues that we're working with. Broadband is huge in the rural areas because we just don't have enough access. And I'm very pleased that the Governor's Broadband Development Council just came out with their report November 2nd and said that we need to have a statewide broadband funding program to help incentivize development in our underserved areas. As we've been going through this pandemic, as Senator Hinojosa said, our schools are really struggling because we have areas that we just don't have access. And when you had to go to doing things online, we have students that have been left out, and it's been very difficult for them to even come in when you've got your pods where you come in and get service and all. There's still those that we're really not being able to address. And I'm really thankful for Chairman Price, who did the bill 1960 to make sure that this was being addressed because it's a huge issue in our areas. And the city of Victoria has been working very hard on an RFP to acquire better broadband service in our area. And we're having issues with servers. Seems like there's some regulations that, we'll have a server and then others can't get in. And we have a lot of other servers that would like to. So it's something that we're really focusing on. The city of Victoria is really focusing on, and it affects all my other 6 counties also. So it's something that I think we have to really pursue this next session to make sure that we have that access, because now we know how bad it is. I mean, those of us in rural areas knew that we didn't have the service, but it has just been laser focused on what we need to do with dealing with our schools and our students not having access to instruction.
Do you have a specific idea yet? I know a lot of this is being formulated, but do you have a specific idea yet what the legislature needs to do? Fix A, fix B, fix C, something like that?
In talking to my elected officials in Victoria, our mayor they are very focused on this, and it's something that we've been looking to address. And the concerns are that there are possibly some regulations that need to be looked at to be changed, so you have more competition there and have more that can provide. We've got some electric co-ops that are really working on helping to formulate broadband and get them out to the rural areas. And I think we need to partner with them and work as much as we can with them to help work out what those issues are, because they're doing a great job, a really good job. So I think that's the focus we need to go into. But this has been an issue that our city has been working on for the last year of trying to expand our broadband.
Yeah. Representative White, you've been involved in education professionally for years and years, and now as a legislator. We got a question from reader Bridget. What components of House Bill 3, this was the education bill in 2019, present opportunities for investment in rural school systems and rural education strategies, kind of, with the broadband in mind and with the funding problems in mind?
Yes, thank you so much, Ross, for that question, and particularly to Bridget. I think all of HB3 is critical to maintaining the great education our rural people are doing daily, specifically in the pay increases. It's about teacher pay. You have to pay for quality. So HB3 had provisions that allowed school boards with extra funding to attract more great talent to rural Texas as it involves attracting great teachers. Also, as you look at broadband, I think it's going to be a number of things. It's not just going to be one sniper shot, right? It's going to be a number of things. So obviously those telecoms that are already in this space, we're going to have to continue to incentivize them. As Chairwoman Morrison brought up, capitalizing and exploiting the fiber optic cable that's already in the co-ops in their infrastructure, along with their poles, to include the investor-owned electric companies as well. And then we're going to see ourselves filling out with other options as well. I think the state needs to come in a big muscular way, and this is why I say this, Ross. The state does that in the urban areas when they flood in the urban areas, and I love it. I love to see all these economic development projects going to Austin and Dallas. What you do is you concentrate the people in those places, and then it makes it more advantageous for those telecoms to come in and provide that broadband and internet service. Okay, so it's all of the above. If we can, I look at these little videos from NASA. If we can somehow communicate with a little rover machine on the planet of Mars, all the way from some control center in NASA, we should be able to get rural Texas hooked up to the 21st century.
Better internet on Mars than there is in Lufkin. Is that the?
That's what it's looking like. Or Hillister. Yes. Right.
Representative King, you've been involved in a lot of these issues. I think you were, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you were one of the signers of a letter to the Public Utility Commission about the Universal Service Fund and about uses of those kinds of funds to help subsidize local telecom, which is linked to broadband. That money doesn't go directly to broadband, but it's usually or often the same wire. I'm curious what you think about broadband, and I would like to pivot with you into healthcare a little bit and talk about broadband in terms of health and telemedicine, and then healthcare in terms of the state budget.
Well, thank you, Ross, and you've done your homework, obviously, if you saw that signature on a letter. And we did that earlier. Obviously, as has been alluded to and mentioned earlier, the COVID and coronavirus crisis and all of these children having to work virtually and do their schoolwork has brought this issue to the forefront. So interestingly enough, in our part of the world, and I happen to represent one of the areas that by some standards has the lowest connectivity of any place in the state of Texas. And it's a fairly rural areas out in the colonial neighborhoods. And those, ironically, are some of the children that need the connectivity the worst. And then some of the areas where I represent, depends on who brought it in, but some of them, we had a lot of people come to our part of the world to stay in a cabin in the woods, so to speak, in order to sit out the coronavirus. And they told me that some of the broadband that we had in our part of the world was better than what they had in Houston. It just depends on exactly where it is, but it's a real dilemma, and it's something that we need to work on completely. And obviously, as Senator Hinojosa alluded to, we have a lot of hospitals that are closing. Now, I'm fortunate in this district, the 6 counties that I represent, we still have several rural hospitals that are doing a great job. a number of them have working relationships with larger hospitals in San Antonio and Corpus Christi in order to maintain their ability to stay open. But I think that we need some clarification, and there has been some. We need some clarification on the ability for physicians to see patients by telemedicine. And candidly, I mean, physicians got bills to pay too, so they need to be able to bill their insurance companies and be reimbursed for those type of visits just as they can if it was an in-office visit and that type of thing, because their bottom line and their fixed costs are based on that type of fee structure. And so, you know, when an insurance company tries to tell them they can't get as much because they did it telemedicine versus, it's unfair, not only to the physicians and the medical people, but it's unfair to those of us that represent rural communities. So I think the two are going to be crucial in the future.
Representative Springer, as you go into this next session, you're the last one on the ballot on this panel, I guess. You're going to be in a special election next month for Senate, but either in the Senate or in the House, as you go into this session, what are you hearing about, you know, back in Rick Perry's last term as governor, the state decided not to expand Medicaid like some other states have done, and has held that position for a number of years. And I'm curious if circumstances have changed, if that's an issue that you're hearing about as people in rural Texas talk about hospitals, budgets, all of this kind of stuff. Is there a chance in this session we expand Medicaid or have another discussion about it?
I think the discussion will always be had. I don't see that we're there yet to do the expansion. I think that Dr. Oliverson and Dr. Bonin in the House have been working on several things that will allow us to continue to have health care provided not only in rural Texas, but in all of Texas from an accessibility standpoint and an affordability standpoint. And you know, I see us going from there, you know, whether that is some of the things that Representative King mentioned with telehealth, but also in looking at different forms of making sure that we have price disclosures and we know what we're doing from that aspect. And then also looking at, you know, some of the other models that are available from the feds, FQHCs, Fairly Qualified Health Centers, are a piece of a solution in there, but there's no magic one bullet or else we'd already done it. But we've got to continue to work on those.
Senator Hinojosa, you know, you're on the Finance Committee, and you know this Medicaid expansion conversation has been going on for a long time. We had a question from Ellen who wanted to know what the chances are for expanding Medicaid coverage in this session.
I think, quite frankly, you will see a strong push to expand Medicaid coverage for Texas. We can call it a Texas plan, require copay, but we're leaving over $90 billion on the table over a 10-year period. This is money that our taxpayers pay to the federal government income taxes, number one. Number two, what's happening is we have the highest uninsured rate in the nation. And now with pandemic, we had an additional 700,000 people uninsured who lost their job. And here's the key. A lot of these folks, Texans that need health care, they are going to the emergency room. Well, guess who pays for that? Those of us who can afford to pay end up having to increase our pay for health care to cover those who are uninsured through the property taxes or higher insurance rates, or we can pay directly by higher charges from the hospitals. You know, it is really to me, it's a common sense approach. We need to take an approach that's practical and not based on ideology. If you look at other states that have done this, Republican and Democratic states have done this, and they've been very successful in drawing additional funding to be able to take care of the uninsured, provide better health care for their citizens. And we need to do that here in Texas.
Representative Morrison, is there a better way to do it? I mean, the state has gotten along all these years. I guess we're coming on, well, I'm going to have to make this up, 6 or 7 years without expanding Medicaid, and seems to have done okay. I mean, there's a bunch of money out there, but the state's got some other reasons to stay out of it. How do you think that argument shapes up this time? Have circumstances changed?
Well, I think, you know, it's something that as Representative Springer said, it's something that's going to come back to the table again to talk about. But I think, the other thing is you have to look at all the negatives of what can come with it also. So I think it's something that, we need to go in and study and look and see where we are with all of our health care. But it's not all just benefits. There are also some other issues that come with it. So definitely something we have to look at. I mean, rural hospitals and healthcare is huge, of course, issues in our area. For example, in Aransas County, which I represent, they were left without a medical facility recently when their Code 3 emergency room closed and the urgent care closed. And so they were left without any medical access. And as we talked about, partnering with larger communities such as they're close to Corpus, but that's still too far for someone that has a medical emergency. You really need to have that. And so they just worked on, they had three propositions on their ballot the election day. And one of those propositions, Proposition C, was one about having more money for health care, and working with the GLO. We're working to try to make sure that they do have access and have a facility come. And that did pass. And so we're working on making sure that we have that, because part of this was due to Hurricane Harvey too. So I think we have to look at the whole picture and not just decide that one thing is going to solve everything. And so I think that's what we'll be doing during the legislative session.
Okay. Along those.
And let me add, because I do agree with Representative Morrison, that we need to look at the whole picture. But our healthcare system, quite frankly, is a rickety, outdated system with a lot of gaps in the system that we found out during the pandemic. And we have studied this issue as long as I can remember being in the Texas Senate. I think it's now time to dig in and try to figure out what best fits the state of Texas. We can make a lot of changes, but what takes care of our needs, to me, is the key.
Representative White, we had a question along these lines from Dale, who said in the past 10 years, more than 20 rural hospitals have closed in Texas, leaving people with no or limited access to health care. How will the Texas legislature address those hospital closures? Is this a matter of the state spending money? Is this a matter of the state changing some regulations? Is it a local issue and not a state issue? How do you come at that? While we're waiting for his internet to catch up with him, Mr. King, you got a take on that?
I do. On the Medicaid expansion deal, I was thinking about it. It's an interesting thing. We have studied it to death, and I don't remember the number. I think we're one of only just a handful of states that haven't opted in. But you go down to the coffee shops in my part of the world, and they ask you about health care and stuff like that, and why the hospital's closing. You bring up Medicaid expansion, and they say, well, what's the deal with that? We heard something about it. I said, well, it's a 9-to-1 match. And they say, well, who's 9 and who's 1? And I say, well, our 1 and their 9. And they go, well, why wouldn't we do that? And I said, well, the governor doesn't want to do it. And they say, oh, okay. Of course, they still vote for that governor, but they can't understand why we turned down a 9-to-1 match either. And it's just an interesting situation that you have out there. But I sure think it'd be a big help in fixing this budget hole that we've got coming up. I don't know how long it'd take for the money to start kicking in. It might be too late for this session. We need to look at that. But I voted for it every time it's come up.
Representative White, look like you're back with us now. If you're talking about rural hospitals, whether or not you expand Medicaid, is this an issue that the state needs to pour some money into, or what do you think the approach should be? Do I have you? I don't have you. Mr.
Ross?
Springer, you want to try that?
Yeah, absolutely. And as somebody who's had 2 hospitals, so I guess I have 10% of those ones that have closed in my district. But one of them, hadn't had a surgery since the 70s, hadn't delivered a baby since the 70s. It was 10 miles from a much bigger hospital. Our model of healthcare is also changing at the same time, and we've got to be cognizant of that. On the federal level, one of the problems, and Congressman Arrington out of Lubbock is working on a fix to where you can leave an emergency room open in a rural hospital and still get compensated at the same level if you don't have inpatient services. But that's one of the problems we have in our rural hospitals is they get forced to run inpatients when, most of the time it is treat them in the emergency room, stabilize them, give them that great health care, then transport them to a major hospital where they're going to spend time in the hospital if they spend, because so much now is done on outpatient anyway. We just don't fill those rooms. So I think it is working with our federal partners to make sure that we've come up with solutions that allow those to provide the services that are really needed where we don't pay for things that nobody's really using.
Is it mostly a federal problem, or are there some things the state should be doing?
No, it is definitely interwoven. There is on the Fed side there, but there are some rules and regulations in the Medicaid side of the system as well that need to be addressed and talked to. In traveling the Senate district, I've been meeting with several of those folks and coming up with items that would help reduce the cost on their side. And so we talk a lot of times about revenue, but we got to remember there is the other side of the ledger on the cost side. And if we can reduce costs that's not benefiting the patients, we need to take advantage of those.
Okay. Representative Morrison, we've got a census coming in sometime. I'm not sure exactly when it's going to be delivered, but we're walking into a session or into a period where we would redistrict the state. This is drawing the political maps that will, depending on how all the argument goes, will be in effect for up to 10 years. How do you see this affecting rural Texas? I mean, it looks like the population in Texas is proportionately migrating into the triangle that's kind of described by Dallas-Fort Worth on the north, Houston over on the east, and Austin and San Antonio on the west, at the expense of rural Texas. Is rural Texas representation in jeopardy here?
Well, I'm always very concerned about rural Texas and being represented, having been through the redistricting process twice already. That's always an issue because we are not growing as much in rural Texas, of course, with all of the metropolitan areas and what's happening, and very true. That's what I've been explaining to members that have not been through redistricting before. Basically, you start there and it kind of comes out to us and to the rural areas, and then you have to figure out how you get your representation in the rural areas. So yes, I'm very concerned about rural representation, very concerned about how we get there and make sure that we are still represented. And that's one of the reasons we have in the Texas House the Rural Caucus, who all rural members are part of, and we work together to make sure that we are represented. Some of our issues are very similar with some of those areas in the metropolitan areas, depending on where they are. And so we have a lot of members that work with us that are not necessarily what you would think are rural members, but it's very important that we are represented, and we have a lot of land mass, but not as many people. But it is very concerning when we look at the census, and I am concerned about the census being a low count. We don't know how it's been. I mean, with the pandemic and not being able to do it like we normally do, I am concerned about the numbers. But we will be working together as rural members to make sure that we do have that representation, because it is very critical to our state and critical to our constituents that we have the services that we need, and so that we are represented well.
Senator Hinojosa, there's an argument to be made. I've heard it made in redistricting before. You probably have too. That the Senate is a little bit has a little bit of immunity to this migration from rural to urban and suburban, since Senate districts are so big that even urban senators sometimes, or suburban senators sometimes, have large swaths of rural Texas to represent. Do you buy that theory, and do you think that this underrepresentation of rural Texas might extend to the Senate after the census?
Well, here's what's happening. Quite frankly, 90% of the growth is taking place within that triangle that you described a while ago. Rural Texas continues to lose population. Obviously, when you lose population, you continue to lose representation. So it's a real challenge. At the end of the day, whatever the legislature decides, from my experience, the final decision will be made by the courts. I think just every session, or every decade that I've been involved in redistricting, and I think I've been involved in 4, the decisions that we make in the Senate or the House are never final. It's the courts finally end up deciding what lines and what to be drawn. The loss of population in rural areas, I don't see how you can manipulate that, if you will, for lack of a better word, to provide more representation for them, because the bulk of the population is quite frankly in the urban areas. But I will say this: for us, like for me, I have 2 urban areas and there are a lot of rural areas in between. So in the Senate side, there are only 31 senators. I think our it's about 900,000 per district. What that means is that we have to also represent rural areas. And that's a way to deal with a lot of the issues and needs. And that is to have state senators that are very responsive to their needs. Obviously, there are a handful up in Dallas, up in Houston. They don't have much of a rural area. But the bulk of the senators have some type of rural area in their district they need to respond to.
Representative White, when you're going to the legislature and, to your colleagues in the legislature and saying, rural Texas needs to be heard even if its representation drops after the census, you're being outnumbered by the cities to some extent. How do you make that pitch? I mean, what's the reason for a suburban or urban member of the House or Senate to throw in with rural Texas?
Thank you
any given issue?
Yes, thank you for this question, because representation comes in many ways, right? Obviously, it comes in population. That's the main way we do it. But you also got to look at economic importance. A lot of your oil and gas, the senator brought this up earlier, a lot of that revenue comes from rural Texas as far as oil and gas. When you look at our agriculture, you got to eat. You got to have something to eat. That is critical. And then, it's just a whole idea, Ross, of we have public schools and other state infrastructure that's key to the growth of our state. So that's why it's important that we continue to have strong rural voices in the Texas legislature and throughout state government.
Mr. King, there was a conversation during the last legislative session in 2019, back in the days before COVID, before a recession, all of that stuff, that we were addressing, the legislature was addressing public education in a significant way, and that they might come around this time and address higher education in a significant way. And there was a lot of conversation about higher education in rural Texas, community colleges, and that kind of thing. What's the state of that now?
Well, of course, it's no secret that, in my view, your community colleges are the key to higher education opportunities, because they can provide that service so much less expensively than some of the universities can, because their focus is specifically on that particular topic, as well as your vocational programs. And so I think there was a lot of work on that. I always tell people when I speak to, higher education, there's never been a lawsuit that was ever filed, a federal lawsuit to defend higher education like there has been for public education, like there has been for prisons and things like that. And so they're sort of in an awkward spot when we have a budget. And so what we've seen historically is when we have budget shortfalls, higher education usually doesn't get a whole lot. And then when we have surpluses, generally speaking, higher education does very well, and they play a lot of catch up. That being said, if the budget is as bleak as it looks like this time, candidly, it's going to be a tough year for higher education. But that's not to say that they don't need the funds and that we shouldn't support them as much as we can. But I'm just being candid. I think that's unfortunately what we're looking at. And if anybody disagrees, I'd be glad to.
Well, how about TRBs?
This is tuition revenue bonds, right?
Yeah, correct. I mean, the growth that's taking place in higher education in our college and universities across the board continues to grow and expand. So they need more space. I think right now, quite frankly, I agree with Representative King that it's going to be a tough session for higher education. So let's use TRBs. Right now, the interest rates are extremely low to be able to help fund at least the infrastructure and the buildings they need to accommodate the increase in students.
We just have a couple of minutes left, and I'd like to kind of do a quick round robin with you guys. What are your hopes, really, briefly for rural Texas in this legislative session, and what are your fears? Representative White, let's start with you.
Well, my hopes are that we're able to maintain our fidelity to House Bill 3, that monumental rewrite of the school finance bill. And what are my fears? My fears are that we do not maintain substantive fidelity to HB 3.
Representative Morrison, what do you think about that?
Well, and I agree. I mean, we made great strides for education the last session, and we have got to continue and really press to keep the funding for all of our schools. I'll go back to Senator Hinojosa's comments too and Tracy's about higher education. We have not funded higher education in many years very much. TRBs are about the only way that we can. I've already been approached by University of Houston, Victoria about where we're going to be with TRBs because we're expanding greatly in Victoria, building buildings, having students. We are a minority serving institution. We don't have another higher education institution of 4 years in a 100-mile radius from us. And so but we serve students from all over the state. And so with that and making sure that our community colleges have what they need, that is part of rural Texas and what we provide for education. And I think that is a critical funding need that we need to make sure that we do the best that we can to keep funding and support what we did last session and help our higher education.
Representative Springer, biggest hope, biggest fear for rural Texas in the next session?
My biggest hope is we don't get so focused on the big things that we don't realize that we have some small things that we've got to fix for our districts. The CT funding for small schools and rural schools was not set correctly in HB3, and it's hurting them and those kids that are not going to go to college, and we need to fix that. But at the same time, we got to realize it's not a one-size-fits-all state. That may be that we figure out, like we did last session, that Medicaid funding in rural Texas is slightly different than the urban centers that can make it up with volume. And we've got to be open to those type of things. And so that's my hope as we go through, that we continue to make sure that rural Texas stays vibrant. And I guess the big dream I have is we would figure out how to move FTEs, that's employees, out of Austin into the rest of the state. Now that we do have more technology and other ways of communicating, we ought to share that wealth and those resources throughout the state. Representative
King.
Well, mine are the same as Chairman White's and Chairman Morrison, and Chairman Springer actually too. So, we got to protect the gains that we made in public education. We need to continue to work for more money for the junior colleges and higher education. And candidly, my biggest fear is that we don't do that for some reason that, I don't know what it might be right now. But I'm optimistic that this legislative session, you're going to see a real bipartisan push to do that. I really am optimistic. I feel good about that.
All right. Senator Hinojosa, what do you think?
Well, I'm always an optimist. I think the way we handle public education by increasing the funding allotment per student by $1,000 is a big help for all our schools. Dual credits, community colleges working with our rural areas. Dual credits are very key to continuing to advance to higher education. I'm concerned about the healthcare issue dealing with our rural areas. It's just a result of a system that's in place in healthcare. I'm very concerned about our hospitals. But on the bright side, agriculture is very much key. When you go to HEB, the food you buy came from somewhere. It's our farmers. Number two, oil and gas. I really anticipate that the price of oil and gas will increase, and they'll help our rural areas. Number three, I think, quite frankly, wind energy. Most of our windmills producing electricity, energy are in the rural areas. And I think number four, as we continue forward, we need to focus more on some of the needs and quality of life healthcare to attract some of the students that leave rural areas and get an education in Austin or Dallas or outside the state, return to the community and be part of the solution.
Okay. With that, we're out of time. We could go on for hours, but that's it. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you to Senator Chuy Hinojosa and Representatives Tracy King, Geanie, Morrison, Drew Springer, and James White for joining us. For more coverage from the Texas Tribune, visit texastribune.org and help us keep the conversation going by becoming a Texas Tribune member at texastribune.org/give. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.